Steve, let's go ahead and throw it to you to talk a little bit about that 2016 meeting.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Marty, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today to kind of give an update, a review of what we did in 2016. But the one thing that I do want to say is that I want to reemphasize what Doug said, and that's one of the points that we did this was because we wanted to be at the table. And if you don't have something that you can show why you should be at the table, then typically you won't be. So that's why we did this 2016. I think that's why this is important now. And I think that's one of the outcomes of this is so we can be at the table to bring these issues to bear on some of the policy decisions and other things that are going on. So without any further delay, so David, I'm just gonna have you advance the next slide. And this is probably not a surprise to anyone in the room here necessarily, but I think it's important to kind of, reemphasize impacts here because this is a lot of what we're feeling. This is a lot of what we're seeing. Our cropping systems are being impacted by invasive species. It's addressing production, it's addressing management decisions, risk of human diseases, our forest systems. I'm going to show a picture here in a few minutes about what that looks like, but there's a lot of damages going on, reducing habitat, and addressing a lot of environmental services. There's this kind of reverberating impacts across systems when invasive species are involved. Next slide. Rangelands, no surprise here. If you've been watching the news, I think it's obvious, especially when we talk about invasive annual grasses, fires, but other things are being affected as well. And our aquatic systems also, we see a lot of impacts in riparian areas, oceans. So it's another area where invasive species are having an impact. Slide. So losses by invasive species, and you can just keep going through your data. So obviously management costs. We know that when an invasive species is present or multiple invasive species, we're going to have mechanical, chemical, those kinds of integrated pest management. But there's a cost with those. That happens. Research and monitoring programs. A lot of what we've talked about, a lot of what you all represent, research side of things. There's a cost to that. Reduced crop yield, I already mentioned that's a direct effect of invasive species. Job losses, where we see reduced production in forest systems. There's people that are actually being affected by invasive species in their livelihoods. Impacts on international trade and tariffs, where we see contamination, things like that. That's not a surprise there. I think that's something that we're all aware of as well. So, but the other question that is there, and the reason why we're in the room or the reason why we're online is the impacts of climate change. And again, I should kind of put this in context. This is the incentive for why we did the previous forum on invasive pests and climate. So impacts, what are those? And so this is where I don't really know how this really came about, but I think it was a realization that this needed to be addressed because it wasn't being addressed. And so next slide, we have things like this going on. And this was a photo by Jeff that he provided that's in the summary report, but you probably can't see it really well, but I think you probably understand that where there's brown trees, that's result of the mountain pine beetle. And it's not just a few trees here and there. We're talking major swaths of trees and forests across the landscape. Next slide. And Jim provided this in his talk, very nice description of kind of these hot spots for, in this case, diseases. And then overlaying on that, what is that? How does that relate to different climate attributes, such as rainfall events or things like that? And how are they expanding? How are they, being more of a detriment to human health? So a couple of examples here. There's many more. I'm not going to go into all that. Next slide. Other than we decided that at this time it was something that it was needed, and I think through my discussions with the National Academies of Sciences and just number one, knowing that this was a really important topic, but we didn't want it to just be within the Northeast IPM Center. We wanted it to be national. And so I talked to the national academies, kind of had this idea, and they said, well, that's great, but you know what? We need money to make this happen. No surprise there. So if you go to the next slide, we got a grant from NIFA, $50,000 conference grant. And again, I should say that this was not just the Northeast IPM Center. There's a lot of other organizations involved, ASA, Banner, the climate group there at Cornell that Mike's part of. And we have the USDA Northeast Climate Hub. So we convened the meeting October 4th through the 6th. We had 26 scientists from climate and pest disciplines, and I was very intentional on making sure we had not just biologists, and that was critical, but also the folks working on the meteorological side, the folks doing the modeling kinds of things. And so because we wanted to hear this, what is the interaction and what are the effects of how climate is impacting pests, but we also wanted to discuss ways to create more resilient and productive agriculture forest ecosystems. Now, I'll get to that in a second. And one thing that I will say is that we didn't quite meet all of our objectives, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's the reality of the situation. So long-term goal, we wanted to bring attention to and strategize ways to develop resilient agricultural and forest ecosystems impacted by climate-induced changes in pest distribution and severity. It's a mouthful, I know, but it's actually, I think, a lot of what's driving this meeting in a way. And I think it's really important to say, that's where we're trying to get to, this resilience. We talk about resiliency in a lot of our production and natural areas. And that's, I think, really what the goal is on the practical impact management side of things. Next slide. And I think as Marty already kind of showed, that there's this alignment. Back in 2016, there's alignment with the AfriAg and Natural Resources Science for climate variability and climate change challenge areas. So we were in line with that. And we also were focusing on reducing greenhouse gas footprint of US ag and forestry while maintaining resilient, productive ecosystems. So just making sure that we were in line with existing policy, existing documents that were out there, kind of like what we've seen here already. So what happened? Our objectives were to, first of all, we wanted to learn. I think that's something that we're here to do. As scientists, we're always want to learn. So we're trying to learn what's the current research, on this topic. Next. We also want to understand the strategic consequences of potential shifts. Okay, so knowing the basics, but then what is the impact of climate? And then finally, ideally, is develop regional frameworks to support pest management decisions that will lead to more sustainable U.S. agricultural and forest ecosystems and changing climates. So this framework was something that we didn't quite get to. And that, I think, needed to have some more discussion on what does that actually look like? Is that a kind of a climate hub feature? Is that more of maybe a university kind of a led effort? We didn't get to that, but we did get to these other two. So let's go through this really quickly. And I'm just going to talk about, this is and again, you can read this report. It's in the bulletin and it was published in 2017. It's online, but some of the things that we hit on, and this is not a surprise. Talked about climate model development application was really good. Example of pest responses, we had really great examples. Several individuals came and talked about that. What was the impacts to humans and responses by humans? Assessments and trends. So where are things going? What is the kind of the future look like? Invasion pathways and preparations or lack thereof. And then decision making and network analyses. So these are very high level kinds of summaries of what came out of that or what was discussed. But like I said, you can go read. It's all written in the article that was summarizes the forum. So next slide. But some things that were discussed, and this is kind of I tried to capture those kinds of hallway conversations because, and that's going to occur here as well, right? We're going to hear presentations. And then there's going to be discussions that are either going to go on in the meeting or those are going to go on afterwards. So some of the things were discussed, the realization that climate pests is not just an emerging issue. Kind of a no-brainer now. It's a fundamental problem that is well entrenched in many regions within the US. And you can call it different things, like I think we've already heard, but things are changing and they're changing fast. And so this realization that it's not just, oh, I think like Mike said, 2100, it's actually now. And that's, I'm not telling you anything you didn't already know. All right, next point. So identification of significant lack of coordination between agencies, federal programs, government legislatures, individuals. And this was also one of the efforts of this forum, was to try to bring universities in. We had some private companies come in. We had some, obviously, agencies. But what I found is, now that I work for a federal agency, is you can get them in the room and you can have a great kind of, you know, discussion of how things should be and would really work well if we coordinated. But then after the fact, and I think Tracy brought this up, the staying power, the kind of keeping that momentum going, because we're all busy and we all get distracted with other things, that's the challenge. So this coordination piece is really important. And if any of you have a way to do that, that is very effective, I'd love to talk to you more. But anyway, next to the next point. I'm gonna hit it one more time. Okay, so there's an extensive amount of information was presented and shared, and that was great. And I think that's really helpful to get us start kind of put your mind in the right place. Yet only the surface was scratched. 26 individuals does not represent everyone involved in this topic across the US and even globally. So very small. And obviously much more is needed to address the challenges in research, education, and outreach. Okay. And so we can see that basic and applied science focused on climate pests with readily known outlets for disseminating information to growers, policymakers, and researchers is lacking. Hold on a second.
Oh, sorry.
So, and I want to emphasize this because, and this again, I'm sorry, Tracy, I'm going to go back to your point of how do we keep this going, and this is the other thing. Coordination is important, but also where do you send, how do you get this out, and how do you constantly make sure that you are in the front of people's mind and not in the back? And this is, and we do this really well with extension programs. And also the Northeast has a nice, you know, presents information on a weekly or maybe it's every week basis. So that's really helpful. But those kinds of things, how do you coordinate that so it actually has the impact that you need? And the impact that we need is to make sure that we're at the table. Next slide. Okay, so, and we also identified there's some important groups that we're missing. We didn't have economists. We didn't have a lot of social scientists. And we had no legislative representatives. Now, this is a scientific focused meeting. So, you know, is it realistic to get legislative representatives? Maybe not, but I've seen actual scientific presentations in legislative sessions. So there is a place for those individuals here as well. How do we do that? That might be a different topic. Next point. So this is my last point. Although it was not organized to implement new policy directly, we had a lot of good discussion on how this should affect policy. And I'm assuming that, you know, from this workshop, that's going to be one of the aspects as well is, yes, our science is great. It's really important. It's really valuable. But how is it affecting policy and how is it changing the bigger topic that we're trying to focus on here? Next slide. So, is this only the beginning? I hear many unknowns related to climate pests. Trying to stimulate discussion, fostering collaboration, and ultimately directing action to convert individuals, regions, and countries from being reactionary to more proactive in dealing with climate and pests. So I think that's where I'm sensing that's where this is hopefully going. We want to kind of build on that and see where we can go with this. So I think my last question is, how will this workshop build on the progress made by the forum? So I'm excited to see this. I think this is really great. And I would like to see, something like Marty said, come out of this that has that impact that we're trying to capture. But it's definitely not an easy thing, as I think it's obvious, and a lot that needs to go into making that happen. So that's a very, very quick summary overview. If you go to the next slide. So there's this little thing about that I've come up with, this weed out, and this goes back to the coordinating and helping kind of bring people together. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I will say this is an effort to try to make connections, and it talks about weeds and projects that are spread across the country. Maybe this is something that could be implemented in other pest arenas that could actually bring in a climate component just to address that coordination issue. But at least I always have found it hard to work on. So I think that's it. I don't know if there's any questions, if we have time for that, but I'd be happy to answer anything that I can.
Let's do a couple of questions.
Sure.
So Steve, first of all, I just want to comment, I feel your pain about trying to keep the traction going on issues when you're in a federal agency. Because it's always, what was the current hot issue that just winds up swamping the one you were dealing with prior to that. So the other thing I would add is that when it comes to trying to get legislative interest in something like this, we hosted a number of things like that when I was at NIFA. We never got anybody to show up, even when they committed to be there. Neither them nor neither the member of Congress nor the staff member showed up. So it's a battle, and it kind of gets back to that communication issue, because I think sometimes we write our documents in a way that don't resonate with certain audiences, and how you sell something to the general public versus the scientific community versus a decision maker, I think doesn't always fit into one neat little box. So what we may wind up having to do is writing documents that have different angles on them for the audiences that need to read them.